Our devotion, homily, sermon for today. And the two passages that we read were, I think, go hand in hand together in a very interesting way. We had the passage of the Ten Commandments in Exodus, and then also we had the passage of Jesus in the temple, flipping over tables and getting a little wild in the temple with the money changers. And when we think about Jesus going into the temple, Jesus is not very happy. Boy, he's not very happy when he shows up in the temple. The temple was supposed to be the center of Jewish society in the first century. Their entire religion was based around temple worship, going to the temple, and it was meant to be a place of meaningful encounter with God, a place of communion with God, pure worship. It was supposed to be set apart for religious practice. But that is what it was supposed to be. It wasn't necessarily the reality when Jesus showed up. So Jesus comes into the temple. He doesn't like what he sees, and he doesn't like what he sees because they charge people to come into the temple. They charge people money for sacrifices. They set up booths for taxes that often exploited poor people. And Jesus was just not having it today. He comes in, he flips things upside down, literally. He comes in and disrupts and subverts what's happening in the temple. And Jesus has a way of doing that, of just kind of showing up and disrupting the status quo of what's happening, of disrupting the ways in which others take advantage of people, of disrupting the systems that people created to oppress others or to appropriate God's religion for other purposes. And he says, "You have turned my Father's house into a marketplace." And one of the side note, what I think is pretty interesting about when he says that is the Greek word for marketplace is also the word emporium. So it's like you think about the temple emporium. It sounds like something that's on the side of the road in Pigeon Forge or something. It means market, trading post, this kind of economic store that they've created. And he was confronting the broken realities of his day. He says, no, this is not how things are supposed to be. You should not be using God's ways in co-opting them for profit. You should not be exercising this exploitation and power over people. Stop doing this, stop it. And Jesus, again, showed up and disrupted this system. And he says, this is not how things are supposed to be. And he turns everything upside down. The second passage of scripture we read this morning is a familiar one, and I think, again, in an interesting way, connects with the passage of Jesus in the temple. The Ten Commandments are one of the most well-known lists in all of human history, but some people don't really know what to do with the Ten Commandments, particularly some Christians, pastors, theologians. In the Restoration movement, we have a complicated history with the Ten Commandments. Alexander Campbell, in his Sermon on the Law, argued vehemently for Christians not to be bound by the old covenant law, going so far as to say the law or Ten Commandments is not a rule of life for the Christians. True Christians do not need them. True Christians do not need the Ten Commandments. And interestingly enough, that's what got him excommunicated from the Baptists. They were like, all right, that's it. We're done with you. Get out of here. And I understand where he's coming from. He was living in his context and his time with rigid religious rules or structures. And so he was reacting against that. And so I'm not here to bash Alexander Campbell. But I do think that the Ten Commandments and the law have wisdom for Christians. And I don't think that we need to use them for kind of a strict regulation or practice or legalistic view of them. But I do believe they're still important to the life of Christians. The Ten Commandments are really a fascinating list or a fascinating piece of literature, really. But sometimes we approach them in kind of a trite or very minuscule legalistic way. We have a tendency to kind of individualize everything and make everything super personal about Christianity or theology. And while the Ten Commandments do have an element of personal responsibility and nature to them, I don't think that they're necessarily, or we should think about them just designed for individuals, but more for community. They were written as habit-forming precepts and guides for the community of the Hebrew people. They were the values and vision of a community. And sometimes, again, we may think of them as kind of myopic moralisms for the individual. Well, if someone has a nicer toy than you, don't covet that toy. Well, you ought not take the trash or mow the grass on Sunday because that's the Lord's day. And that's all well and good, but again, the Ten Commandments are much more than that. They were given to a community to help form that community in how they think, how they live, and how they interact with the world. And there's something bigger going on. We shouldn't miss the forest for the trees when we look at the Ten Commandments. If you think about the Ten Commandments as an embodiment of the wisdom of God, the wisdom of God disrupts the world, subverts the world. Paul says that God makes foolish the wisdom of this world, and the Ten Commandments make foolish the wisdom of this world, I would say. The Ten Commandments for today, I would like to look at them on kind of a macro level rather than just looking at micro this and this and this. I'd like to look at them on a macro level because I think the Ten Commandments call into question how we interact with the world, call into question the wisdom of the world in which we live in, and they run counter to the world, and they should help form how we live, breathe, think, and interact as individuals, but also, more importantly, as a community and as the people of God. Just like Jesus flipping things upside down in the temple, I would say that the Ten Commandments enter into society and then they flip things upside down as well, just like Jesus in the temple that day. The Ten Commandments are an abiding representation of the wisdom of God. And again, God makes foolish the wisdom of this world. We're not going to go through every single commandment because we don't have time for that today. But I would like to consider a few of the commandments together and look at them on a macro level. So let's start with, you shall have no other gods before me. Perhaps this is the most disruptive and subversive commandment itself. And it's perhaps the most disruptive act the church can engage in within the world as affirming that there is only one God and then devote ourselves to that one God as opposed to the gods of the world. And there are multitude of interests, agendas, institutions, organizations, and subjects competing for our allegiance in the world. Some we realize and some we don't. A multitude of gods crying out for our allegiance, just like in the day of Moses. One of those gods that persists in our society is money. Jesus has a lot to say about money, one of which is you cannot serve both God and money. And money is probably perhaps the greatest of the gods, lowercase g, competing for our allegiance in the time and place that we live in. Another god fighting for our allegiance is the god of entertainment, the god of kind of self-consumption and mindless activity and slothful existence, numbing ourselves with leisure while forgetting the needs of our brothers and sisters. We can make entertainment or laziness or slothfulness or our god as well. What about ourselves? We become our own gods. We live how we want. We do what we want. We believe that the individual, us, ourselves, is more important than the community. We can become our own gods when we think about it. For some people, their jobs become their god. And when their jobs become their god, they offer sacrifices to their god. Many times, time with their family will be offered to the god of their jobs. They will ignore other responsibilities and offer those to the god of their jobs. And the altar, what Walter Brueggemann calls it, the altar of your career, that we bring sacrifices to the altar of our career and give them up to another god. You shall have no other gods before me. This commandment really connects with the other ones too, about no graven images and not taking God's name in vain. And this is another one. Usually we think about this in regards to personal language, not taking God's name in vain in our personal language, which I think is important. And of course, we should not take God's name in vain in our personal language. But I also think it's a bigger message than just that too. What if taking God's name in vain also refers to the times when we use God as a religious cover for our own actions or purposes? Is that not also taking God's name in vain? Co-opting God or co-opting religion for things that God is not really behind. Nazi Germany, there were lots of pastors who cloaked what they were doing in theological terms. And did they not take God's name in vain? Throughout history, there's been plenty of people who've used scripture to justify racism Have they not taken God's name in vain? And how many people take God's name in vain by, again, co-opting God, co-opting religion, co-opting theology to sell more books or make more money or gain more followers or get more influence? That too is taking God's name in vain, and perhaps maybe a more serious uh, manner of taking God's name in vain. You shall have no other God before me, and you shall not take my name in vain. That day in the temple, they had taken the name of God and signed it onto their own project of economic gain, of exploiting people in service of their true God, money and power. And Jesus came in and flipped that upside down. So when you think about the Ten Commandments, think about what were the Ten Commandments that were going, or how were they breaking the Ten Commandments in the temple that day? And I would posit that they were worshiping not the true God, but the God of money and influence and power, and also taking the Lord's name in vain. All right, what about the commandment of the Sabbath? This is a fun one. You could have a whole sermon just about the Sabbath. There's tons of books written about the Sabbath as well. I once knew someone who would not take the trash out on Sunday, even if it was full to the brim, because it was the Sabbath. You don't do anything on the Sabbath. And I once tried to explain to him that the Sabbath is not actually on Sunday, and he would not have it. He couldn't understand it. But what's funny is he would have his young son take the trash out on Sundays. So I guess he was under the age of accountability, so he could sin on the Lord's Day. There's something bigger going on here, though, than don't do anything on Sunday. Again, I think we have a tendency to just kind of individualize and personalize this. But the Sabbath, really, when you think about it in a larger sense, a theological sense, is a marker to assert that our time is not our own, that humankind was not meant to work ourselves to death and sacrifice our lives at the altar of productivity. That's another altar that we bring things to all the time. We live kind of in a world that values constant efficiency, constant growth and productivity over anything else, including people's health. And again, those things are not inherently bad. But when we sacrifice our whole existence to those things, and we sacrifice our health to those things, and we just continually work ourselves to death, then that is, in my understanding, or in a theological sense, breaking the call for Sabbath, the call for rest. Sometimes we reduce life to production and consumption. Life has to do with the creation, the management, and the consumption of things. And if not confronted, this sort of system will literally work us to death. And it's a very real world thing too. I mean, you think about places where people are actually worked to death, people in sweatshops. And I think the Sabbath has something to say about situations like that, about people that are literally worked to death. But in our lives as well, when we just constantly pour ourselves out without filling ourselves back in, we have to remind ourselves that God took a rest. That's what the Ten Commandments say too, that God showed us that Sabbath and rest is important. So God steps into this and says that life is more than just productivity. Life is more than just your job. Life is more than just the production and consumption. And life is more than just busyness. Sometimes we use busyness to distract ourselves as well. And again, what were they doing in the temple that day? They had created a system of worship that reduced life to just kind of production and consumption, that worship was a commodity, that you bought it, then you sold it, and you did it, your thing, and then you went back and you were fine. Jesus says no. God says no. The Sabbath disrupts the values of busyness and constant efficiency over human life and flourishing. Jesus came in and flipped that upside down. The final commandment I want us to discuss is thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not covet. I'm breaking out some King James here this morning. We usually think about this in relation to personal acts of envy, which again is important. Someone has a nicer car, a nicer toy, a better opportunity, a fancy boat. Don't envy them. Don't get jealous. And I think that's part of what the text is getting at. Again, I think it is also much bigger than just our own personal acts of envy. I think it's a theological understanding of what as well. On a macro level, the commandment is getting at the larger issue of from of constantly just accumulating stuff. That's what we're supposedly meant to do, is just, you're born, you're constantly told you need to really human. I mean, look at the commercials that we have sometimes. Like, your life is not complete until you buy this brand new Lexus, or you've never lived until you've had Oreos or something. I mean, it gets absolutely ridiculous at times that we have not completely lived until we've tried the new flavor of Cheez-It or something. But there's this lie that we have to acquire more, that we must buy more stuff. And boy, do we love stuff, this kind of stuff and that kind of stuff. Sometimes we even have too much stuff that we have to buy places to put all of our stuff. And our culture has a strong conviction that there is no limit to what one can and ought and should accumulate. More property, bigger houses, better cars, more lavish vacations, more investments, more. And into that cultural conviction enters this commandment: thou shalt not covet. Do not reduce your life to the accumulation of goods. Do not covet people who have a different life than you or different items than you. Do not waste your life on the compulsive drive for more and more at the expense of your neighbor. Do not covet. Do not foster greed. I think that this commandment too reminds us that we are more than the objects we own. We are more than the house that we live in. We are more than the car that we drive. We are more than the stuff that we have. And we're meant for more than coveting, more than just kind of self-enrichment. And what were they doing that day in the temple? They were selling and buying more and more at the expense of others, collecting religious taxes to build fancier temple furniture and fancier robes, and exploiting the people that were there. And Jesus came in and flipped it upside down. So when we look at what was happening in the temple that day, I think we can use the Ten Commandments as a paradigm to think about what Jesus was trying to stop. That the wisdom of this world says that we should worship the gods of money and power and entertainment. The wisdom of this world says that humans are nothing more than producers trying to get ahead at any cost. The wisdom of this world says that life is about accumulating more and more, that is the wisdom of the world. But again, what does Paul say? Paul says that God makes foolish the wisdom of this world. The Ten Commandments make foolish the wisdom of this world. What does the law of the Lord say? Thou shalt have no other God before me. Thou shalt remember the Sabbath. Thou shalt not covet. And these are not simple, pithy, moralistic sayings. They are words that point to the very fabric of what it means to be the people of God, to orient ourselves in the world for God. They are disruptive and subversive words which confront the wisdom of this world. And sometimes they flip tables. Sometimes they go into places and disrupt what is happening, just like Jesus disrupted what was happening that day. And I don't know about you, but I think sometimes we need to flip things upside down as well, in our lives, in the world, in our community. And when we do that, we can rest assured that we're doing it in the tradition of Jesus of Nazareth, who was doing that as well. Amen. That's the reflection that I have for us today. I didn't really think of many questions or discussion items, but I kind of would like to think about, like, what are the, outside of just the simple view of what the Ten Commandments are, how or can or should or do the Ten Commandments shape your life or our life, or the way that we interact in the world?
Matt, that was very helpful. I don't know if I've ever actually framed the Ten Commandments as primarily a tool to help create the alternative kind of world that God envisions. That was really, really helpful. I've been thinking a lot lately about one of the things that I think we've idolized in contemporary American culture is ideologies. And I think even Christians often, I see now that ideologies have taken a place right alongside God. And maybe there's even a kind of syncretism or blending of the ideologies with Christianity so that they can't be separated out. And there are ideologies at the left and the right, rather than being a kingdom focused way of thinking. So thank you for that. I'm going to run the 10 Commandments through that grid because that's something God's been laying on my heart a lot lately. I like your language of, I've always framed it as an alternative kind of world, an alternative community, but I like your language of confronting the prevailing culture that existed in that era.
Walter Brueggemann has a really good book. It's just like 90 pages about the Sabbath. And he goes like hard in the paint about how the Sabbath is totally disruptive to how we function in our modern society. It's really, I mean, yeah, it's pretty good.
Some of us on here are old enough to remember the days when you had to buy gas, fill up your tank on Saturday because on Sunday the gas stations were full. Mm-hmm. And I think about, you know, Walmart employees who they don't personally work 24/7, but they work all kinds of crazy hours to keep the place going just so that the market can continue and goods can be sold. And what is it Amos says, let's hurry up and get the feast over with. Go back to the marketplace.
Matt, I just wanted to reiterate what Jody said. That was a really good way to think about the commandments, and it was something, you know, I don't think that any of us think about, except that we always talk about how Jesus fulfilled the law, you know, that we can't just throw it out, but we don't have to think of the 10 Commandments as the only law, because there's a lot of other things we need to remember to live too.
One of the books that I remember reading several years ago was
I personally use honor thy father and mother.
You go right ahead, Danny.
Oh, go ahead. I was just saying, one that I had a lot of fun with using was honor thy father and mother. Vernon and I both said that lots of times, raising two daughters.
I was going to say that a book that I recall reading was by Ronald Mill called The Tender Commandments. And it was, it viewed the 10 Commandments as an expression of God's love. And I really, you know, found it as a helpful way of sort of reframing how I look at the 10 Commandments, instead of being these, you know, ominous and burdensome laws, but that they were really about drawing God's people to something much deeper than themselves.
Great. Well, thanks for that good discussion. We'll move now to our time of communion.